Imagine this. You wake up one morning and the world feels slightly off. The colors are muted, the air heavier. You go through the same rituals, coffee, mirror, screen, but something in you feels like an actor repeating lines you no longer believe in. You laugh when expected, you nod when spoken to, you scroll through other people's lives with the dull ache of envy and disinterest intertwining. Somewhere deep inside, a quiet question begins to whisper. When did I stop being alive? You're breathing, thinking, eating, technically alive. But there's a hollow kind of living that mimics existence without truly touching it. It's what the ancients might have called a living death. You have a job, perhaps a purpose, maybe even a family. Yet underneath it all, you sense something rotting in silence. The pulse of meaning that once guided you is gone, replaced by a pulse of obligation. You no longer act, you react. You no longer dream, you maintain. The frightening part is not that this happens suddenly, but that it happens slowly, so slowly that you mistake decay for stability. You start to confuse survival with living. You find comfort in routine and call it peace. You fear change and call it wisdom. You begin to wear your numbness like armor, convincing yourself that detachment is strength, that cynicism is intelligence, that busyness equals purpose. And so you go on breathing, while something essential inside you begins to die. Every civilization has warned about this spiritual death that occurs long before the physical one. The Stoics called it dying to the self. The Buddhists named it samsara, the endless cycle of mechanical existence. Nietzsche described it as the death of the spirit under the weight of herd morality. And yet, here we are, modern, educated, connected, and still starving for something real. How can a person live surrounded by abundance and still feel utterly empty? Maybe it's because somewhere along the way, we stopped asking what it means to be alive. You measure your life by achievements, by progress, by the digital applause of strangers. You chase sensations that fade the moment they arrive. You fear stillness because in stillness, you'd have to face yourself. The truth is that many die not when their hearts stop, but when their curiosity does. Have you noticed how the world quietly rewards the walking dead? The obedient worker, the polite consumer, the predictable citizen. Systems of power thrive on your half-life, your quiet compliance, your slow surrender of vitality. They teach you how to make a living, but never how to live. They convince you that safety is the highest virtue, that risk is reckless, that comfort is happiness. But comfort, when worshipped, becomes a coffin. To die before you're dead is not a tragedy, it is an invitation. The death we're speaking of is not physical, but psychological, the deliberate death of the false self. The self that clings to image, approval, and fear of loss. This is the death that precedes rebirth. Carl Jung wrote that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. To truly live, you must first die to illusion, to all the stories that keep you small. But this is where most turn away. Because dying before death means surrendering control, letting the ego crumble, allowing old identities to dissolve. It means admitting that the life you've built may not be yours. It means facing the possibility that everything you've believed about yourself, your ambitions, your fears, your relationships, was constructed to protect you from truth. Few are willing to do this. It feels like annihilation. But in that annihilation lies freedom. So here you are, caught between two lives, the one you know and the one that calls to you from the depths. The first offers safety and recognition, the second demands courage and solitude. To cross from one to the other requires a kind of death. Not of body, but of illusion. The kind of death that terrifies the ego but liberates the soul. Ask yourself, what part of you needs to die so the rest of you can finally live? What old dreams, expectations, or masks still chain you to a version of yourself that no longer breathes? What if dying before death is not the end, but the only true beginning? In every myth, the hero must descend into darkness before returning transformed. Orpheus, Christ, Osiris, all faced symbolic death. The pattern repeats because it speaks to a universal truth. There is no rebirth without dissolution. You cannot awaken while clinging to the person you were. So imagine standing at the threshold, one side familiar, the other unknown. You feel fear, but also a strange pull, as if something ancient within you recognizes this path. You know what's required. You must die before you're dead. And this raises the great question, the one that has haunted mystics and philosophers for centuries. What does it really mean to die before you die, and how do you do it without losing your mind? That's where the descent begins. The reason you fear dying before you're dead is because the part that must die is the one you call you. It's the mask that's been built, brick by brick, from every expectation ever placed upon you. Society gave it a name. Your parents shaped its boundaries. Your culture fed it desires. Over time, you learned to mistake this structure for your identity. You became fluent in its language of should and must. And when the voice of your true self began whispering from beneath, you drowned it out with noise, because the silence terrified you. Carl Jung once said that people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. He was right. The moment you begin to question your inner machinery, the ego panics. The ego thrives on repetition, on narrative continuity. It tells you, if this part of me dies, I'll vanish. Yet the opposite is true. When the mask dies, what remains is the unfiltered awareness that was always there. The hidden problem begins the moment you begin believing your performance. From childhood, you were rewarded for fitting in, praised for obedience, punished for rebellion. Slowly, the instinct to explore was replaced by the instinct to conform. You learned that being acceptable was safer than being authentic. You learned to laugh at jokes that weren't funny, to suppress tears that made others uncomfortable, to silence questions that threatened the fragile order around you. In the process, you built a false self, what Jung called the persona, and allowed it to take the throne. The persona isn't evil. It's necessary, to a degree. It helps you navigate the world's social labyrinths. But when the mask becomes the master, the soul suffocates. And so begins the long psychological sleep, a life lived through roles instead of realities. This is why you fear stillness, why you feel restless when alone. Stillness strips away the narrative. It leaves only the raw presence of existence. And without a story to cling to, you feel as though you're dissolving. Modern life amplifies this discomfort. The digital world feeds the ego endless mirrors, each reflecting a slightly different version of who you might be. Likes, comments, achievements, they all reinforce the illusion that you are the sum of external recognition. But the more mirrors you gather, the less reflection feels like truth. Arthur Schopenhauer observed that most people mistake the will to live for living itself. What he meant was that human beings are trapped in the restless cycle of craving, desiring endlessly to fill the void within. The will drives us to seek pleasure, status, validation, but it never ends, because the will itself is bottomless. You think you're chasing life, but you're really fleeing death, the death of identity, of certainty, of egoic control. And so you run endlessly. You pursue goals not because you love them, but because stopping terrifies you. You scroll through feeds, chase promotions, accumulate experiences, all to avoid confronting the unbearable simplicity of being. You keep your mind busy because an unoccupied mind begins to remember itself. Yet beneath all this motion lies the still, steady truth. No external achievement will ever make you feel alive if you are running from yourself. Aldous Huxley warned that men do not learn much from the lessons of history, and that is the most important of all the lessons of history. In psychological terms, history repeats itself within the individual. You repeat patterns of avoidance, you rebuild prisons from new materials, you disguise old fears as new ambitions. You believe you're evolving, but often you're only rearranging your cage. Each layer of progress adds polish to the mask, while the soul beneath grows paler, quieter. This is the root of the hidden problem, the fear of nothingness. To die before death is to encounter the void, the realization that the self you defend so fiercely is an illusion. Sartre called it nausea. that disorienting awareness of being thrown into existence without inherent meaning. Most people flee from that insight into distractions, careerism, religion, romance, ideology, anything to avoid the dizzying openness of freedom. But in escaping the void, they also escape themselves. You've been taught to fill every silence, to label every emotion, to control every outcome. You've been taught that purpose must be found out there, in goals, relationships, systems. Yet the greatest teachers, from Buddha to Nietzsche, warned that freedom begins where attachment ends. The more tightly you cling to identity, the more brittle it becomes. The more you fear loss, the more enslaved you are by the things you possess. There's a peculiar irony here. People spend their entire lives trying to preserve what was never truly alive. You defend the ego as if it were a fragile deity. But the ego is only a strategy, a tool the psyche uses to make sense of chaos. When it becomes the ruler, you live in constant tension between who you are and who you pretend to be. Jung called this the split between the persona and the shadow. The persona wants approval, the shadow wants truth. The longer you repress the shadow, the louder it becomes, manifesting as anxiety, depression, addiction, or self-sabotage. The unlived life always demands expression, even if it must scream through suffering. To die before you're dead, then, is to stop protecting the mask. It is to allow the persona to fall apart and to face the raw chaos beneath. But this inner death feels unbearable because it dismantles everything you've used to define I. It reveals that the I was never stable, never singular. Nietzsche described this as the moment one becomes a dancing star, a self born from the destruction of the old self. Yet before the dance comes the collapse, and collapse feels like death. Modern psychology often avoids this existential dimension. It wants to fix symptoms, not confront meaning. But without confronting meaning, healing becomes cosmetic. You can treat anxiety, but if the anxiety springs from a life unlived, the wound remains. Viktor Frankl, who survived the camps, understood this. He saw that those who endured were not necessarily the strongest, but those who found purpose in suffering. To live is to bear the tension between despair and meaning, and to die before death is to face that tension without retreat. This is the hidden problem. Then, you confuse your mask for your life. You fear losing what was never yours. You mistake identity for essence, safety for peace, control for freedom. You've been conditioned to survive, not to live. But to die before death requires something far more dangerous than survival. It requires surrender. The surrender of illusion, of story, of self. And surrender feels like madness, until you see that the madness was clinging to the lie. When a person forgets how to die before they're dead, the decay begins quietly. It doesn't roar in with tragedy, it seeps in through convenience. It starts with small compromises, the skipped passion, the silenced truth, the dream postponed until later. You trade depth for stability, meaning for comfort, authenticity for acceptance. And the moment you do, something sacred begins to erode inside you. The great tragedy of modern existence is not that people die, it's that they never truly live. The world is filled with bodies moving, but few souls burning. Look around, endless consumption, endless distraction, endless noise. Every face lit by the glow of a screen, every mind restlessly searching for the next hit of digital stimulation. We call this progress, but it feels more like hypnosis. You are surrounded by infinite content, yet starving for contact. You scroll through 1,000 lives, but can barely touch your own. This is the unseen consequence of spiritual sleep, a society of the undead. People who confuse activity for purpose. People who confuse being seen with being known. People so desperate to avoid stillness that they fill every gap with motion, until their inner silence becomes unbearable. The philosopher Eric Fromm once wrote that modern man is both self-aware and profoundly disconnected, that he has become an automaton who experiences his life as if it were someone else's dream. You might smile at this idea, but somewhere inside, you recognize its truth. You've lived it. You tell yourself you're just tired, overworked, overstimulated. But fatigue isn't the disease, it's the symptom. The deeper sickness is existential. You have lost the thread of meaning that weaves your life together. Viktor Frankl called this the existential vacuum, the sense of inner emptiness that arises when life becomes mechanical. When your actions no longer serve a higher purpose, you begin to move like a puppet, animated by external forces but hollow within. And yet, society rewards this emptiness. The system needs efficient machines, not questioning souls. It rewards conformity, not courage. You are told to stay busy, to compete, to keep up. You are told that constant productivity is virtue. But productivity without meaning is just a well-organized form of despair. You learn to measure your worth in numbers, followers, income, achievements, and mistake these metrics for life itself. The tragedy is that success, as defined by the world, often requires you to abandon your aliveness. The more you achieve, the more you risk losing the one thing that makes achievement matter: your soul. The psychological toll of this disconnection is enormous. You feel restless but can't explain why. You experience a constant background hum of anxiety, a subtle dread that surfaces in the quiet hours of the night. You think something is wrong with you, so you chase more pleasure, more distractions, more validation. But the hole remains because the hole is not in your life, it is in your being. You are missing yourself. This disconnection manifests in countless ways: addiction, burnout, obsessive self-improvement, or the endless pursuit of meaning through others. Gabor Mate, who spent decades studying addiction, observed that the question is not why the addiction, but why the pain. The addicted mind isn't weak, it's hungry. Hungry for aliveness, for connection, for the raw immediacy of being. When life becomes numb, even suffering feels like proof of existence. This is why many unconsciously sabotage their own peace. They'd rather feel pain than feel nothing. The unseen consequence of avoiding inner death is the quiet death of empathy. When you cannot feel your own depths, you cannot truly feel others. Modern alienation is not just individual, it's collective. Entire cultures drift into numbness, mistaking comfort for civilization. The entertainment industry becomes the new priesthood, offering cheap transcendence in place of real transformation. Consumerism promises resurrection through purchase, and the masses bow before it, mistaking transaction for transcendence. And yet, beneath the surface, humanity groans. The rise of anxiety, depression, and loneliness is not a coincidence. It is the collective symptom of spiritual suffocation. We've replaced initiation rituals with consumer milestones. We've lost the sacred art of symbolic death, the ritual passage into a deeper state of being. Ancient cultures understood this intuitively. They knew that to mature spiritually, one had to descend into pain, into uncertainty, into darkness. Without that descent, the psyche remains shallow, fragile, hungry. The modern mind avoids darkness at all costs. But what you avoid grows in power. Jung warned that what you resist persists. By avoiding the symbolic death of the old self, you guarantee the slow decay of the soul. You spend your life maintaining an identity that was meant to evolve, guarding illusions that were meant to die. In doing so, you become a caretaker of your own prison. The greatest illusion of all is control. You think you can manage your life like a system, optimize your habits, fix your mindset, manifest your desires. But beneath all this self-management lies a deep fear, the fear of surrender. To die before death is to let go of this illusion, to accept that control is the opposite of flow. You don't need to conquer life, you need to dissolve into it. But the ego trembles at the thought of dissolving. It confuses surrender with defeat, when in truth, surrender is liberation. The longer you postpone this inner death, the more life loses its pulse. You begin to feel disconnected even in moments of pleasure. You start to experience time as monotony. The seasons blur, the years dissolve, and you wonder why the days feel both endless and fleeting. This is the texture of living death. Everything looks the same because you are no longer seeing, you are remembering how to see. And yet, buried within this despair lies an opportunity. The pain of emptiness is not punishment, it is a message. It's the soul calling for resurrection. The anxiety that haunts you is not a flaw, it is an invitation. Something within you knows that your current way of living is too small for what you are. The inner death you fear is simply the birth of something vaster. But to reach that birth, you must confront the decay head-on. You must look directly at your numbness, your distractions, your hunger for meaning, and stop trying to fix them. Only by observing your own emptiness can you see that what you've called you is merely a shadow cast by conditioning. And when you finally dare to see that shadow for what it is, something begins to stir beneath it. A strange, silent presence that was never asleep, never afraid, and never born. That presence is what remains after you die before you're dead. To die before you're dead requires rebellion, not against governments or religions or social norms, but against the mechanical parts of yourself that keep you trapped in repetition. It is an uprising of consciousness against habit, of awareness against conditioning. And every true rebellion begins in silence. The first act of liberation is to stop running. Not to meditate in search of peace, not to journal for clarity, not to fix yourself, but simply to stop. To stand still in the storm of your own mind. When you stop, you begin to hear it, the low hum of your own avoidance. The restless whisper of the ego saying, "Don't stay here, it's too quiet, too dangerous." But stay, because what you fear in that silence is the sound of your resurrection. Dying before death is not about destruction, it is about seeing. You cannot transcend what you refuse to see clearly. Most people try to escape themselves through change. New goals, new identities, new philosophies. But the self that seeks to change is the same self that needs to die. The rebellion, therefore, is not adding more, but subtracting. It is the courage to watch your illusions dissolve without replacing them with new ones. Nietzsche once declared that one must have chaos in oneself to give birth to a dancing star. Chaos here doesn't mean disorder. It means openness, the willingness to exist without the comforting map of certainty. The mechanical mind craves order. The awakened mind embraces mystery. To die before death is to stop demanding that life makes sense and to begin participating in its mystery directly. This rebellion is terrifying because it has no guarantee of reward. It offers no instant bliss, no guaranteed peace, no step-by-step guide to enlightenment. The ego wants methods. The soul wants freedom. Freedom begins when you stop asking, "What will I get if I let go?" and instead ask, "What if I never let go?" Only then do you see that your grip on identity is the very thing strangling your vitality. To rebel is to turn away from the false light of certainty and step into the darkness of your own unknowing. Every mystic, philosopher, and poet who has glimpsed truth has done this. The Buddha sat beneath a tree not to achieve enlightenment, but to face the totality of his suffering. Socrates drank the hemlock not as defeat, but as fidelity to his own understanding of truth. Christ carried the cross as a symbol of the death of egoic control. Their stories are not religious dogma, they are psychological maps of the same journey. To awaken, one must die to who one thinks one is. This death is not violent, it's honest. Honesty is the weapon of rebellion. When you start telling the truth to yourself, even in small ways, the false layers begin to crumble. You admit you are afraid. You admit you are lonely. You admit you are confused. These confessions are not weakness, they are the cracks through which light enters. Carl Jung believed that the first step toward individuation, the process of becoming whole, was the willingness to face one's own shadow without judgment. Truth is not discovered, it's revealed when the lies stop being necessary. The practical rebellion begins in the simplest places. When you wake in the morning, resist the reflex to reach for your phone. Sit for a moment in the rawness of existence, the strangeness of being conscious, breathing, and mortal. When you feel anxiety rising, don't distract yourself. Watch it like a scientist watches a new species, curious, detached, alert. When you feel the urge to control, pause and ask, what am I afraid of losing? Each pause is a small death, the death of compulsion, of blind reaction, of mindless continuity. Another act of rebellion is solitude. Not isolation, but solitude, the sacred space where you stop performing. Most people fear solitude because it mirrors their emptiness. But that emptiness is not your enemy, it is your teacher. When you can sit alone without needing to be entertained, you begin to encounter your own depth. In solitude, masks fall away. The voice of the crowd fades, and what remains is something ancient, a presence that observes without striving. That presence is not new, it's what you've always been. To die before death is also to forgive yourself. You will fail. You will relapse into old patterns, cling to old comforts, get lost in illusions again. But every failure is another opportunity to die, to let go of the perfectionist ego that demands purity. The path is not linear, it spirals. You return to the same lessons but from higher ground. Each time you surrender, a layer of falsehood peels away. As the false self weakens, something extraordinary happens. Life starts to feel alive again. Colors return. Conversations deepen. Small moments, sunlight through a curtain, the smell of rain, begin to carry unbearable beauty. This is not sentimentality, it is perception restored. When the noise quiets, the world reveals its sacred texture. Every experience, no matter how mundane, begins to pulse with quiet divinity. You realize you never needed to seek meaning. Meaning was always waiting for you to stop running. But freedom has a cost. Once you see the machinery of illusion, you can no longer pretend. You can no longer blame others, because you understand how willingly you participated in your own chains. You can no longer live for approval, because you've tasted what it's like to exist without masks. This is the burden of awakening, to live in truth even when it isolates you. Yet paradoxically, it's also the birth of compassion. You see the sleep of others not with judgment, but with tenderness. You recognize the same fear that once ruled you. To awaken is not to separate from the world, it's to love it from a deeper clarity. The rebellion, then, is not grand or dramatic. It's quiet. It happens in invisible spaces, in moments of awareness, in acts of truthfulness, in the courage to feel fully. To die before death is to participate consciously in the eternal process of dissolution and renewal that governs everything. You don't escape the cycle, you become part of it. You start to see that every ending is a beginning wearing a different face. That every loss is a reminder that nothing truly belongs to you. And in that realization, something ancient stirs: gratitude. Gratitude not for possessions or status, but for the sheer, inexplicable fact that you exist at all. This is the rebellion: to die before death, to surrender before being forced to let go before losing, to awaken before ending. It is the only act that cannot be taken from you. And from this quiet death arises something no system, no ideology, no fear can destroy: the beginning of life itself. There comes a moment in every inner death when the silence no longer feels empty. It begins to hum, softly at first, like a low vibration underneath the noise of thought. You can't explain it because it isn't something you feel about yourself, it is something that is yourself. This is the moment when you understand what dying before death truly means. You have not disappeared, you have dissolved into something larger. Imagine standing on the shore after a storm. The sea is calm again, but different, wider, deeper, infinite. You realize you were never the storm, never the waves, never the anxious swimmer fighting to stay afloat. You were always the ocean. You simply forgot. Every fear you ever had, every illusion you defended, every craving that burned you alive, they were all ripples on the surface of the same vastness. You mistook movement for identity. This realization is not poetic, it is terrifying. Because the you that sought enlightenment cannot survive it. The seeker dies with the search. The ego has nothing left to grasp. You see that the entire architecture of your suffering was built from resistance. resistance to impermanence, to loss, to uncertainty. You spent your life clutching at experiences, believing you could hold on to them, but everything you've ever loved was already dissolving in your hands. To die before you're dead is to finally stop fighting this truth. It is to see that impermanence is not the enemy. It is the very rhythm of existence. Life is not something you possess. It's something that passes through you like wind through leaves. You are not the leaf, you are the wind. And the wind needs no name. The deepest liberation comes when you stop trying to be someone. You realize that all suffering begins with the word I, the desperate attempt to carve permanence into the flow of being. But when you look closely, the I begins to crumble. Thoughts arise and pass. Emotions bloom and fade. Even your body changes moment by moment. What remains? Awareness itself, the silent witness that was present before you had a name, before you had fears, before you learned to pretend. That awareness is not personal. It has no story, no past, no ambition. It simply is. This is what the mystics meant when they said the kingdom of heaven is within. It is not a place, but a state of perception unclouded by identity. The self must die so that the witness can awaken. Jean-Paul Sartre described consciousness as nothingness. Not as nihilism, but as freedom, the blank canvas upon which reality paints itself. When you die before death, you realize you are not trapped in a story, you are the space in which stories appear. Life is not happening to you, it is happening as you. Every sound, every touch, every breath becomes sacred because it is no longer filtered through the machinery of judgment and desire. Existence itself becomes an act of wonder. This realization doesn't make you invincible. It makes you transparent. Pain still comes, but it no longer defines you. Fear still arises, but it no longer possesses you. You grieve, but your grief has depth. It does not consume, it expands. You begin to see that life and death are not opposites. They are dance partners, perpetually giving birth to one another. Death, seen clearly, is not the end of life but its constant companion. It is what gives life its texture, its urgency, its beauty. Carl Jung wrote that, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." What he didn't say outright, but what his work implies, is that to become who you are, you must first lose who you think you are. The false self must die for the authentic one to emerge. But the authentic self is not a personality, it is presence. It is what remains when everything else has been stripped away. In this awareness, even suffering becomes sacred. Schopenhauer believed that life was defined by suffering, that to live was to wrestle endlessly with desire. Yet if you go deep enough, you see that suffering is not punishment, it is transformation in disguise. Every loss burns away attachment. Every failure dissolves pride. Every heartbreak widens the aperture of the soul until only love remains. Not sentimental love, but the raw, impersonal love that says yes to everything, to beauty and to ruin alike. You begin to understand what the mystics meant when they spoke of death as union. When you die before you're dead, you cease being separate from life. You become its expression. The boundary between you and the world thins until it vanishes. You realize that when you hurt another, you hurt yourself. When you love another, you love yourself. The separation was always illusion, a trick of perception. And then something extraordinary happens. You stop striving. Not out of apathy, but out of trust. You stop trying to manipulate reality into fitting your desires. You begin to flow with it, to participate in it. You act, but your actions arise naturally, like waves following the tide. This is what the Taoists called Wu Wei, effortless action. Life moves through you rather than against you. You are no longer the actor performing life. You are the stage upon which life unfolds. To die before you're dead, then, is to awaken into aliveness so pure that even death cannot touch it. Because death only ends what was temporary, and you have discovered what is not. The body will fall away, the memories will fade, but the awareness that animates them was never born and can never die. That is the secret hidden in every religion, every philosophy, every myth. Immortality is not something you achieve, it is what you already are. The final paradox is this: once you have died before death, you no longer fear death, but you also no longer cling to life. You walk through the world lighter, quieter, freer. You laugh more easily, because you see the absurdity of pretending permanence in a world built on change. You love more deeply, because you no longer need to possess what you love. And when the final moment comes, when the breath shortens and the eyes close, you will not fight. You will recognize the familiar rhythm, the great return, the dissolution into what you've always been. To die before you're dead is not a morbid idea. It is the beginning of wisdom. It is the realization that what you call your life is a wave in an infinite sea, and that the sea itself is your true home. You have never been apart from it, only dreaming you were. So let the old self die. Let every illusion fall away. Let everything that is not eternal within you burn. What remains will not fear, will not cling, will not pretend. It will simply be. And in that being, you will discover the truth whispered by all sages, poets, and seekers since the dawn of consciousness. You were never meant to survive life. You were meant to become it. If you've stayed with this journey until now, thank you. Not just for watching, but for daring to look inward, for standing at the edge of your own mind and not turning away. Every soul who chooses to question, to feel deeply, to face their own shadow, adds a little more light to this strange and beautiful world. DeepPsyche exists because of people like you, seekers, thinkers, wanderers of the inner world. Your presence, your time, your reflection, they mean more than any number or algorithm ever could. If this message stirred something in you, carry it with you. Let it challenge you, disturb you, heal you, whatever it needs to do. And when you're ready, return. There are more depths to explore, more questions worth asking, more lives within you waiting to be lived. Thank you for watching. Until next time, stay awake, stay curious, and don't be afraid to die before you're dead.